The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Drawing on Disability, Comics Including Difference. This is the last webinar for this year's season. I'm Lisa D'Amico, your moderator and webinar organizer. Today's webinar is part of a monthly series that comes out of the Office of VSA and Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. This series addresses topics related to arts, disability, and education. If you would like to view live stream captioning of this webinar, you can follow the link you see on the slide and in the chat box of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Before we get started, let's take a moment to ensure that you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen. This control panel can be hidden by clicking on the orange arrow in the top left corner. If you need to leave the webinar early, you can exit out of the program by clicking on the X in the upper right corner. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you can catch up on any parts you miss. Make sure you've selected telephone or mic and speakers to correspond with how you're connected to the webinar. You have the ability to submit or answer questions, which is especially encouraged in this webinar, using the chat pane located near the bottom of the control panel. If you would prefer to say the question instead of typing it, you can click on the raise your hand icon on the control panel and I will unmute your microphone. Your questions will come directly to me, and during the designated question and answer time at the end of the presentation, I'll relay them to our presenters. I want to emphasize that in the week following today's presentation, I will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint, a helpful handout, and a copy of the transcript. This means you don't need to worry about frantically taking notes during the presentation. You can go back and watch the recording and review the supplemental materials. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is the last webinar in this year's season. Our webinar calendar follows the fiscal year here at the Kennedy Center, so we're in the final stages of creating next year's lineup. Once it's finalized, I will send it out to the VSA webinar mailing list, and it will be posted on the Kennedy Center's website. So mark your calendars and stay tuned. That's coming out the first week of October. If you're active in social media, I invite you to connect with us using the hashtag VSA webinar. You can connect with us on Facebook at VSA International. You can also join us on Twitter, as my social media intern Courtney will be live tweeting today's webinar. Please say hi to her over there on Twitter. And our Twitter handle is VSAINTL. You can also join us on Instagram at VSA International. And with that, I will turn it over to today's presenters, Karen Kiefer-Boyd, Michelle Kraft, and Veronica Hicks. So I'm now going to enable your webcams so everyone can see you. And then I'm going to turn it over to Karen. There you are, Karen.
Is the PowerPoint up there?
I just sent you the request.
Okay. There we go. Well, good afternoon. I'm just really thrilled. It's very exciting. I saw the list of people there. You're from all over the country. It's just wonderful that you're here, and I'm just going to imagine I'm talking to Eugene, Oregon, and Maryland, and all over the Florida, and so on. But good afternoon. I'm Karen Kiefer-Boyd, and with Veronica Hicks and Michelle Kraft, we are really pleased to share with you teaching strategies applicable to K through 12. Our teaching strategies are with comics that, as you can see on the slide here, use humor, parody, and metaphor to explore identity, experience, strengths, difference, and capacities, challenge and reclaim what disability means, decenter notions of normal, foster diversity of stereotypes and cliché of disability, and deconstruct disabling systemic social constructions. Our two characters, you can see the hamster and the elder, they are going to help us present our ideas. Right now, you can see they're both thinking about these 5 main points in this introductory slide, and that these points do focus our presentation, and they'll be unraveled as we continue in our presentation. These ideas, I would like to point out, do draw from disability studies on comics that include difference. Veronica, what defines narrative in comics?
Well, the important thing to remember about narrative, as you can see from the second slide, is that multiple panel comics tell a narrative of connection. So the illustrated series of events that you can find in comics is bridged by the artist and reader's imagination. And that's why we find it so useful and such a wonderful way to share stories with people labeled with disabilities. So students with disabilities can utilize the comic medium to aid in discussion and possibly even analysis of events that happen in and outside of school. For example, if a student on the autism spectrum is learning about conflict or conflict resolution between people, by seeing it drawn in a comic strip is an effective way to discuss and analyze such a topic compared to learning about it through a theoretical discussion or just talking to the student, or it might be even more comfortable than acting out a situation of conflict resolution. That might be very disturbing. So instead, we use the comic medium as a successful way to communicate narrative and tell the story that the artist wants to convey. And what's being depicted in the slides that you see are 3 small panel drawings of an activity in a physical education class depicted through comics. And this actually happened with one of my students in the high school setting who was wearing a prosthetic arm. And as you see, they were able to participate fully in the beginning, but then had a bit of a struggle at the end. And this is illustrated very cleverly through these 3 panels.
So why graphic narratives? Graphic narratives tell a story through dialogue and through visual images that give the impression of movement. Graphic novels offer dyslexic readers several different cues to the story. The illustrations offer visual contextual cues to help decipher meaning. Graphic novels have an easy-to-read, accessible format. Graphic novels and manga, comics can portray race and ethnicity, disability, and body shapes and body identities in a different way than prose or poetry can. And that makes some stories incredibly powerful. On slide 3, the titles of graphic novels by artists who have experiences with disability are listed here. These stories are about everyday life, their challenges with environmental barriers and social stigmas. It's about their finding value in themselves as unique individuals and in being part of a community. Swallow Me Ho is a love story of 2 adolescent step-siblings who hold together amidst schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and family breakdown. The dialogue is very realistic, and scenes are really like familiar places to high school students, such as the parking lot and throughout the school. And there's also within these spaces, it's like high school can be, there is hope and foreboding. The art and page design achieves a mood of desperation that the main character Ruth feels, and how at moments her obsessions can actually look like genius. So there's this play between hopelessness, or this hope, and foreboding. It's a 216-page graphic novel, and it's appropriate for grades 7 through 12. Real is really based on, it's a whole series, and it really began in Japan as manga, and it began in 2000. There's been about 14 different volumes in English between 2008 and 2015. On the handout that comes with this, I have some links to interviews with the creators of each of these these three graphic novels that I'm discussing. Real features three male teenagers. One has dropped out of high school. One is an ex-sprinter who now plays wheelchair basketball. And another is a popular leader of the high school's basketball team who finds himself a paraplegic after an accident. And all the three of them find themselves marginalized by society. And they are united by a common feature, and that is their desire to play basketball and no place to play it. This particular story deals with the reality of their physical disabilities and their psychological sense of inferiority that they struggle against, and they break through their psychological barriers bit by bit, but which is sometimes a stereotype. But what happens is the realism is so strong that we actually do start to see that it is environmental barriers and social stigmas that are their greatest challenges rather than themselves. El Deafo by C.C. Bell is a story about a girl with hearing loss who has to navigate middle school with a hearing aid, which gives her this new ability to hear lots of things. She chronicles her life, her hearing loss at this young age, and her experiences with this device, the phonetic ear, and it's very powerful, and it's at this time in the kind of device that she had at her age in this time period. It was very awkward. It was large, and the story, as the story goes, and I'm going to actually tell you in her words how she describes it. But just for you to imagine as I read from her words, that the characters are drawn as rabbits. So she describes the phonic ear was a big, bulky hearing aid. I wore it strapped onto my chest, and I had cords with earpieces that went up to my ears. This hearing aid worked with a teacher's microphone, and basically the microphone amplified my teacher's voice and made it really clear, really loud, just for me. And soon after I got outfitted with it, I discovered that not only was I hearing her wherever she was in the classroom, but I could hear her whenever she was in the entire school building, the teacher's lounge, everywhere. So I had a lot of power, and it was awesome. So this sense of this, and she talked about herself as feeling that like she had this disability, but then this disability was this kind of power that switched for her. So this is what's different about this is that it's not a stereotype, but from her unique and real lived experiences. So given the power of graphic narratives to tell stories in an accessible form about lives that are only often invisible or stereotyped in popular culture portrayals, Michelle is going to share a teaching strategy in her work with students experiencing disabilities.
So I want to go back to some of what was in the earlier slides, how Veronica talked about the importance of narrative, especially when you couple it with images. As Karen said, that ability of graphic novels and comics to combine visual image with narrative gives a much more powerful avenue for self-representation than perhaps literature alone can do, for instance. And so that's what can make it a very powerful tool in allowing for the sharing of stories and those shared experiences. And another way to represent and for self-representation is through perhaps a more iconic form of self-representation in comics. So you've got almost two different ways to approach it, this narrative unfolding, sort of a story of those shared experiences, and perhaps a singular, empowering, iconic sort of description. And so this is something, and that goes back to kind of what Karen was saying about C.C. Bell and about the El Deafo comic strip and her use of the phonic ear. Suddenly she begins to see that as a superpower and something that she had that was different. So recently, I'm teaching right now this fall a secondary pedagogy for a class for art educators at Lubbock Christian University, and we recently invited a group to the campus for a meet and greet, the first time we've met with them, from an autism center here in town. And we're going to be working with them throughout the semester. And these individuals represent all of the autism spectrum almost. We have students who are probably at a chronological age of about 18 to 30, and probably of an intellectual age. It varied anywhere from maybe early elementary or even primary school in some cases to adolescence. And so I wanted to come up with a project whereby we could meet each other, we could begin to formulate community and get to know each other, and also share our strengths and our powers with one another on a stage or in a forum that was going to allow for all participants to be contributory and equal in doing that. So when we went around the room and introduced ourselves, one of the things I said is when we get to you, I want you to tell not just your name, but something that is the strength of yours, something that you're very good at. And so we went around the room and everybody introduced themselves in this way. And then later in our class period together, I said, okay, think back to that strength that you talked about, that you discussed. And I want you to see what would that look like if you parlayed that into a superpower. If you amped up your power, the thing that you were good at, the thing that was your strength, and made it into a superpower, how would that look? And then, if you were to create a superhero around that, how might that look? So, for instance, the example I gave was I love to walk. I can walk with a backpack, without a backpack. I just love to walk. It's a passion that I have, and I'm good at it. So I thought, okay, if I were to make a superhero using that strength, how might she look? And she would be, would her name be Strider? Would it be Walking Woman? And what would her superpower be? And I decided, well, the ability to walk anywhere, vertical surfaces, horizontal surfaces, across water, walk anywhere that there was a surface. And so I, talked about designing a character around that. And so we each went around the room and we designed our own character over a few minutes and had to think, okay, what's the costume going to look like? What's that name going to be? And then we all shared them with each other as a way to sort of reinforce that talent or that power or that thing that we were passionate about. And so the example that you're looking at right there is PC Man. This was an individual, one of the adults on the autism spectrum, who was very good at technology and knew that he was very good at it. And so he designed PC Man as a very powerful figure. You see he has a monitor where his head goes and he is staring at us menacingly through that. He's wearing these strong black gloves, and in his hands he holds computer components as weapons, and he's just in a very powerful position. He's ready for combat. But in this way, the student was able to share a little bit of himself in a very empowering sort of way, what his strengths were, and to use metaphor and to use some of those different aspects pictorially to kind of convey himself and what that talent was. So I'm going to turn it back over to Veronica.
Oh, actually, I'm going to turn it over to me.
Oh, to Karen, sorry.
Okay. So I'm going to, I want to talk about recognizing the social tropes or cliches at work in comics as a really good place to begin to dismantle stereotypes of people with disabilities. And just as the Bechdel test, with its 3 questions, are there at least 2 female characters in the story who talk to each other about something other than a man? Just as that test draws attention to the systemic problem of the representation of women in films and other forms of popular culture, media, dominant narratives in comics, films, and other forms of popular culture of representation of disabilities can generate long lists of comics identified by students. This is where I begin, is asking of the films, the graphic novels, the popular culture, what the students are familiar with. And this pedagogical approach shifts analysis away from specific comics and toward a discussion of systemic social constructions. To begin, I would ask students to create a list with students I would ask to create a list with the students I'm working with of the comics, the manga, the graphic novels that they are familiar. Then I would ask, is disability portrayed in the story? Often it's absent. That is one stereotype, invisibility. According to the World Bank statistics, in 2011, 15% of the world population, approximately 1 billion people, experience disability. So the fact that may be invisible is a problem, and we might need to have representation. If a person with a disability is in the story, does that person have agency? Is that person unique? Historically, disabilities have been looked at rather than embraced. Stereotypes of those with disabilities in comics include, and this is a lot of different studies I looked at, and this is, I've come up with my sort of a grouping of words to help actually even put that in front of the students when you're talking about their comics and the graphic novels that they're most interested in. to see if there are other storylines than this list here that you see, pathetic, or that you can hear. Pathetic, evil, invisible, super crip, joke, whiner, burden, non-sexual, non-human. These are the stereotypes that come up time and time and time again. So there has to be other storylines. After discussion about the stereotypes as they arise in the comics that students mention, we set goals and criteria with students for the creation of a comic. And with this, I'd like to, one of the things I talk about is in teaching that is beginning with, what does this idea of ableism mean? And how is ableism perpetuated in comics and graphic narratives? How does the work address ableism? Well, ableism is privileging able-bodied people over people whose bodies are differently abled. According to Margaret McLean, she, a disability studies scholar, she describes ableism as, and I quote, discrimination on the grounds that being able-bodied is the normal and superior human condition. In contrast, being disabled is linked to ill health, incapacity, and dependence. These understandings become institutionalized in the beliefs, language, and practices of non-disabled people and create barriers to equity and equitable social participation for many disabled people. So I would, with understanding ableism, what we're trying to do is, in the creation of comics, is how can we disrupt, challenge, create counter-narratives to the stereotypes and the cliches that I talked about in the prior slide. So with this, I would give a viewing and reading prompts, such as, what are the ways that exclusion or inclusion are sustained or disrupted? How is a disability marked or signified? Has a graphic novelist, comic artist experienced the disability portrayed in the comic? And is this relevant? How is disability defined or represented in the graphic novel? How does this differ from ADA definitions? What are the concepts of normal and abnormal in the comic? Is there a counter-narrative that can test entrenched language and ideas of normalcy in a way that begins to dismantle hegemonic discourses and social inequities? I have these words on the screen: inclusion, signified, relevance, and counter-normal, as sort of cues to kind of both remind people what it is that we're talking about. Can we create a graphic novel that deals with inclusion, in which the disability is, or basically dealing with how the disability is marked or signified? So these are my prompts to kind of help remember those ideas. Now, as this little hamster says, we need to see ourselves represented in learning materials. And so part of that, when I talk about inclusion and how is the disability, the person experiencing disability signified, that's really important to see role models. And so there's a set of criteria here to think about, is the person experiencing disability presented as a valued person? Is the person presented in a unique way rather than stereotyped or cliche, as the prior slide conveyed? Is the person experiencing disability a contributor, a contributing member to a community, a small group? Are they part of something rather than isolated? So these are ways that we can create a graphic novel from listening to life story, and we can put ourselves into that story. Another thought is we could make characters as animals or personified objects. I've had incredible stories just with the use of pencils, an orange pencil and a blue pencil, and like fourth graders, and the emotions that they feel from even a story like that. We can visualize to locate a memory of feeling valued, unique, and being a contributing member, and try to find that time and that place. And we can create a graphic novel or comic on how not to be complacent in perpetuating ableism. Before we provide further examples and teaching strategies, we think it very important to define disability from a disability studies perspective, to make it clear the difference between impairment and disability, and to ground our work in disability studies. So you can see see or hear on the slide here that impairment is defined as, and I quote from, these are all definitions from the Center for Disability Studies. Impairment is injury, illness, or congenital condition that causes or is likely to cause a loss or difference of physiological or psychological function. Disability, according to a definition from the Center for Disability Studies, is the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in society on an equal level with others due to social and environmental barriers. And it is that I want to stress and try to create an image there that helps us to think about that. The difference is impairment is looking at this lack, this something wrong with the individual, where the disability terminology from a disability studies perspective is the problem is with the environmental barrier and the social stigmas. And what we see here are these stairs with dog and person trying to make it up there, and then down at the bottom of this very steep stairs and difficult for many people to navigate, that there's a door that's also sort of creating barriers, and the person is not mobile. They're sitting in what appears to be a wheelchair, and that really would not work if there is not some kind of ramp or other alternative way to get to the top. So that is an environmental barrier. It is not about the dog or the person. It is about the environmental barrier, and sometimes those barriers are attitudes, which are social stigmas. So here's an idea for an activity, for a four-frame story activity, and we've all used it in our teaching with all ages, range of ages and range of differences. And one thing, and so here's the four-frame comic activity. This is, and I have four different frames here to kind of show what that might look like. So the first is show a time when you were disabled. Thinking of time, our bodies change, and most of our abilities are temporary in the span of one's lifetime. So showing a time when you personally were disabled is a way to bring this, putting oneself into the story. The second frame is to now decenter expectations of normal. And so I use the hamster as one, here's this hamster with a little red sweater, it looks like, peeking, looking at us, gazing at us, actually, not scampering away and afraid, but looking at us. And so this idea of male, female, race, ability, some of those any of those expectations, I don't know, and because he's wearing a sweater and such, we probably don't carry expectations of hamsters, or at least that's disrupting or decentering those expectations of normal. So I use that as an example. A third frame, and so if you're asking your students to do this, the third frame, you would say, okay, now do a parody of that, a beginning of showing that time when you were disabled, and also these decentering expectations of normal. Show a close-up through humor or parody or metaphor, your identity, experience, and strengths and capacities. Well, the elderly woman here is faded in this image in the close-up, and this is to convey how women, when they look or appear old, often are dismissed or ignored. And so this is actually sort of a metaphor of that, with the fading of her face there, of her whole self there. And the fourth frame in this comic is to deconstruct disabling systemic social constructions. In this fourth frame, we see stairs, and which are, as mentioned in the prior slide, that they're inaccessible to some. And this red organic shape here is beginning to redesign in another way to traverse this environmental barrier with red organic movement. I'm not quite sure what the structure is, but it looks like it's included. It's inclusion and it's organic, and one could move, one could slide, one can move through the space, even the sort of sharp edges are smoothed down by this organic wrapping there. So this is an abstract way to talk about deconstructing disabled systemic social constructions. I have given this this activity to classes, different ages, and with very simple examples like this, they really think about, well, what are expectations of normal? How can I show something different? They are able to work with this. It just depends. The more you have examples of others, I know a lot of times people, all they really want are some kind of prompts to get them thinking, and that's sometimes the way to get one going. So Michelle, we'll move to you.
Okay. So this is another example from that experience that we shared with the adults on the autism spectrum. And this drawing right here, we're kind of going back to that idea of using humor and metaphor to represent our own identities and to represent ourselves. And so we're looking at an example here of a war machine and city bus. And this was a student who felt he knew so much about cars, and that there was a lot to know about cars, and so he created this took two disparate ideas and mashed them together into a car that represented his own passion. And so Christina Nunez, who talks about, she is an art therapist, and she talks about portrayal of self and how it facilitates, as you're creating these images referring to self and as you're self-representing, there is a working through of identity in creating these images, even when we're not always aware that that's happening. And so this is, in this way, this war machine and car and city bus sort of come together to represent this student and his passion and his strengths. So at first glance, it may seem that it's not really a portrait of self as a superhero, but metaphorically it is. It is representing this student and his knowledge and his interests, and the bus becomes then a metaphor through which he communicates his identity, his capacities, his interests, and his experiences too. And I'll turn it over to Veronica.
So we asked the question now, why identify narrative perspective? What's important about perspective? Why do we need to even talk about it? Well, perspective establishes a student's story, or anyone's story, the preservation of that story, and sometimes it could be the preservation of an oral history. Could take the form of this visual narrative way through the merger of art and text that's found uniquely within comics. So remember that with the comic medium, it's a form of both literature and a form of sequential art. And that means the overlap and interplay of those two combinations is different ways to acquire meaning, different ways to communicate oneself, and different perspectives from maybe different selves or from an outsider perspective. This is allowing someone who is not very close with the student to understand things that they're trying to communicate. As we see in the image on slide 10, this image is really nifty for this particular slide because it shows a person kneeling down and getting on the level or perspective of a young student, a young schoolgirl. So that's illustrating why it's so important to use the comic medium to wrap around these different ideas and perspectives. And with perspective, it says also on the slide that the narration of a story tells the thoughts and feelings of a character and also the sequence of events. And we'll talk more about sequencing in comics a little bit later.
So there are different ways in comics that you can accomplish the idea of narration. You can narrate the obvious, which may be dual specific panels where you've got both a combination of text and a combination of imagery, which is something that is unique to illustrating through manga and through graphic novels and through comics. In this case, the the text really reinforces what you see happening in the image. On the other hand, the most successful forms of narration could stem from just well-orchestrated sequencing, which Veronica will cover in just a minute. And this can tell a deeper narrative using the images and watching those events unfold. And it also leaves the reader a little bit of space to fill in the gap of the story. And in looking at this one example too of from that class, we see that this individual knew a lot about firemen and about fire stations and firefighters, and so he decided that that was his talent, that was the thing that he knew really well, and wanted to create a drawing for it. And as we look at this image and try to fill in the gaps of what's happening, we see that the student had to think about setting, had to think about this individual being surrounded by fire, and yet he comes out very strong in this particular image. The firefighter in this case, the student was very detailed in providing the mask for the firefighter and the black boots and the black gloves, and had to think about all of these things that the firefighter would need for this protection. So even though verbally the student could respond when prompted in perhaps one-word responses most of the time, what he was able to convey in his drawing really unfolds a much larger narrative in representing self and relationship to his knowledge about firefighters. And you know, it was really interesting to see that. And the other thing that I want to mention is, in so many of these examples, when these individuals shared their superheroes, they used the first person I in talking about these examples. There were only one or two where they used, talked about he or she when they referred to their superhero. They internalized what they were doing and referred to this in the I. I am Supermom, I am whatever, and then shared those strengths. I can do this and I can do that. And so it was really interesting to watch that connection occur between the image that they had created, the image of self with those amped up superpowers, and how they had internalized it into their descriptions of these characters and relating these characters to themselves. That was really, really wonderful to see. And back to Veronica.
So as Michelle mentioned, relationships are what build the comics stories and the narratives. We're going to be talking about on slide 12 sequencing and closure, and I'm going to reference Scott McCloud, who wrote a wonderful book called Understanding Comics. But Scott McCloud mentions the phenomenon of observing parts but perceiving the whole as closure. In other words, closure is the act of mentally filling in the area between separate panels. And this is why comics are such an important medium to use with students labeled with disabilities. It's causing more than just drawing, more than just storyline. There's lots of rapid-fire things going on, and they all get illustrated in a beautiful setting of comics. The slide that you're seeing now has two sections on it, and we're going to start talking about different ways to create this closure or sequencing. And we're talking about maybe one panel comics, two panels, or three. Most of the ones you're going to see coming up are two-panel comics. So that means that we have to fill in what's going on in the gutter, which is the space between the two panels. So the first type is that's featured is moment to moment. Now this can be literally a blink of the eye, the flapping of a butterfly's wings, something so minute, but it could show something else going on. It has probably a bigger connotation to it than when you first see it, so it really makes you stop and look. And so what's featured on the first section of the slide is an image that was co-created with a past student, now graduate of mine, one who wears a prosthetic arm, normally in her daily life. And so you see here the bedroom scene with the lights on before she goes to school, and then in a moment the light is switched off and you see one arm extended to close the door. Happens in a moment. The next part of this slide you see is the section called action to action. So action to action is very distinct. It's usually a single subject, very direct to the point. Usually you see it in superhero type comics. Action to action takes up a lot of comics, and what is illustrated here is just a little fox jumping in the air, presumably at a mouse hiding in the snow, and then the next scene is just the fox's tail and back end sticking up out of the snow as he's buried in it. So very to the point. These are just 2 examples. There's more to go on. I just want to mention that as we continue, for students communicating with a goal in mind to talk about a narrative and a story, there are many different types of sequencing, but the reason why we're using these in particular is because they seem to best exercise 3 different things: the closure or progression of an idea, the reader involvement using their imagination between the gutter, and also the transitions that set an aspect of an idea or mood. So these are higher order of thinking things that we want to tap into, so we're sharing these in particular. The next is a slide that features 2 scenes. So one is subject to subject, and the other is scene to scene. So for subject to subject, this is one panel of the comic moves the reader from one central area to the next. So subject to subject can include a high level of meaningful reader involvement to connect the 2 panels. So the example here is a woman watching the lottery numbers being drawn on television, and we see some text up top, presumably by the announcer that says, and the winning lottery number is, and they rattle off a number. The next panel is an extreme zoom out of the Earth and just a very large bubble that says jackpot. We are making the connection that the woman has won the lottery by that. We're making that in the gutter, and that is a really important skill that's being formed here. The next panel is a scene to scene. Now, scene to scene, we see the gutter, we see the spaces between the 2 panels, and that is the area for transition. The gutter here transports the reader across a significant distance, whether it be place or time. So here we see a scene from ancient Greece where the 2 people featured are saying, now everyone will know, and there is an image of a sculpture holding up an image of a unicorn with a sign that says unicorns are real. The next panel, on the other hand, says this is present day, and now we see 2 figures dressed modernly, and they're saying now we'll never know. And the woman's sculpture is the one that we tend to envision, which is kind of tattered, no arms. So we're kind of filling in the gaps there, and that is really, really significant. Continuing on, aspect to aspect. So this is when a bypass of time is featured. For the most part, this is the same exact scene, but just a different viewpoint, if you will, like a different camera angle or a wandering eye. So nothing happens at all here. It is literally the same thing happening, but just from a different angle. But it establishes a certain mood in that location or a certain idea surrounding that location. So the example that we have here is one panel has a very extreme close-up of a flower and a bee sitting on a petal of that flower. And then the next panel is a zoom out of that, and you see a very serene landscape with a river and lots of little flowers and a tree and some very tiny little bees buzzing around those flowers. There's a connection, but it's establishing a place and a mood and idea. And the last one that we're featuring is non sequitur. So this is totally out of the realm from what we've been talking about, but it is a valid and very useful point of connection from some students. So this is when 2 panels are totally seemingly not connected, but in fact there is a relationship, but it really, really counts on the viewer / reader to make that connection. So 2 panels that totally look like they're not related, but there is a connection, and it's up to the reader to find that connection. So with this technique of sequencing, with this technique of storytelling, we're using that now to talk about coming in, at least from my outsider perspective, of what we might find challenging as a person labeled with disabilities. You hear different labels of handicapped, disabled, using the comic medium is a way to study these perspectives, a way for students to feel empowered by this perspective. And they're accomplishing maybe goals in your school of literacy and also visual arts goals, but they're going about it in a different way. And we want you to see that comics can be that way. It might not be the way for everybody, but I think it's worth a try. And you know your students best, and hopefully this will be something that they can prosper from. So we're trying to change forms of ableism. We're trying to change labels of student bodies. As you see here in this image, this is one that was also co-created with my now graduate from high school. The hardest part of her morning, we were talking about that in an interview. And of course, my outsider perspective, I thought, well, maybe putting toothpaste on your toothbrush would be the hardest part of your morning. In fact, it wasn't. She could do that very easily, even when she wasn't wearing her prosthetic arm. And so we'll talk about what the most challenging part was soon enough.
Just as the example that Veronica shared illustrates a focus on capacities and strengths, and also maybe questioning those ableist notions of disability, so too do these two examples. These are also from that class period where we drew ourselves our strengths as heroes. And so we have two characters here, the reading fascinator and the imaginator. And the reading fascinator was an individual who that was their talent. They could read really, really quickly. And the imaginator, on the other hand, this was a girl who found a great deal of self-worth and strength and empowerment through her artistic ability and her ability to draw. And as she taught, she mentioned her high school art teacher quite a bit and what a force he had been in her life and in empowering her. And this particular character that she created, the imaginator, we see a close-up of a girl, and she is making a sketch. She's working on a drawing, and as she's working on her drawing, she's using her imagination, creating the sketch, and her superpower then is that anything she imagines and sketches can come to life. And we see that happening here as this bubble sort of thing floats out of her pen, and we see this cat creature coming to life. And in this way, she too is using metaphor to share her self-identity, to share her strengths, her experiences, and her capacities, and to really reclaim what disability means in her experiences, in her cases. And so really, as we look at trying to encourage all students towards full participation, one of the things that we see implicit in law dealing with disability is this idea of empowerment through difference, and that's true of any piece of civil rights legislation, just as it is with ADA and with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for example. That whole idea that difference is central to the law, and the full participation of all through their difference and empowerment through difference is part of that key. So such empowerment occurs then in concert with community, and we've been talking all along about collaboration and identifying self within others, that I versus, and not versus, but in tandem with the we of community. And with all of our students, whether they're typically abled or experiencing alternative abilities, being able to teach them how to critically reflect upon the visual images with which we're inundated every day, and to question those, and to the same types of questions that Karen was posing earlier, to sort of see how is self depicted in that, and how do we identify or not identify with some of the stereotypical images that are going on. And in this way, we can value the diversity of community, including all of the community's members, and just creating that strength of community that can only be found in bringing our differences together. So I'm going to turn it back over to Veronica.
So we've been talking about honoring these students' stories, and to continue that, what we have to ask ourselves as teachers and as students and as learners, what are we valuing, what are we contributing, and are we conditioning our environment to be an enabling one, or one where we are not feeling enabled? So this image that you see here was also created along with my student, now graduate. So we're talking about reflections of the school environment. Not only can the students talk about their own oral histories, their own narratives, things that happen all the time, bomb threats, bathroom conversations, gender issues, bullying, standing in line. These things can be described and illustrated through the comic medium, we hope to help the students address these issues instead of feeling confused, feeling shy or hurt, and not understanding them. Getting them out, being able to deconstruct them with a professional, with an educator like yourself, is a way to disassemble these systemic social constructions. And have you been following my own narrative yet? The last slide, a few slides ago, I had asked you, I had pointed out, what do you think the hardest part of her morning was? Well, we're going to talk about it right now. My student's hardest part of her morning was leaving her 2-year-old daughter at home while she went to school. If you notice in the first panel on slide 18, even though there's a star-spangled bedspread, there's still a lump in the middle of the bed. When you turn the lights off, as you see in the second panel, you can definitely see that lump clearly. That lump represents her daughter sleeping in her bed. And she says that getting ready for school, putting on her shoes, putting on her uniform, no, that's all stuff she can do with no thought at all. But the hardest part of her morning is saying goodbye and kissing her daughter goodbye and leaving her for the day. This was something that shocked me as an outsider perspective, but I think it's an important thing that we all realize, that it's not her prosthetic wearing that is the issue. The issue is love and connection, and that's what came out through this narrative.
When Veronica first told Karen and me that story with her study when she was, I think it was from your master's degree, that was such a moving story to hear, because our ableist perceptions would be that it would be some sort of physical capability, or that would be the difficult part of her day. But that connection that occurred because she shared her story, and because there are so many people who can connect on balancing family and education and work and those stories of love, that is something that is the power of narrative, and power of narrative within comics, being able to share these things pictorially. So I'm showing you these two examples as well. And they're interesting to me because both of the individuals who created these drawings recognize the role of self in that larger community, self among others. And so we have on the left Super Friends, and this person, she labored over her drawing so much, but she thinks about herself, she's the one wearing the cape, in relationship to her friendships and the other people around her, and that she is a strong friend, and that is her strength, and is something that she offers within her community. And then also even Super Mom. Here was an individual on the autism spectrum who she identified herself first and foremost as a mother, and she talked about her child, and she said her super strength would be having multiple arms and being able to stretch them out so that she could accomplish everything she needs to accomplish in order to balance the needs of family and work and all of the things that need to be done. And so that sharing of strengths and that empowerment and recognizing their own strengths and capacities that way in their relationship to others within the community is what we see within these drawings. They're helpful in deconstructing some of those disabling systemic constructions that we see showing up so often in visual culture.
Okay, well, I just want to conclude by saying that, as our friend Hamster says, comics are found in everyday life, and it's true. They're everywhere. Whether it be when you are crossing at the crosswalk and you see the hand blinking stop, and right next to it is a panel of usually a person walking across the street. What I would love to leave you with is that students are going to create comics with or without you. As illustrated in the left-hand lower panel, that was a comic done by a 7th grade girl, me. And I didn't have instruction for that, but there it is, and that's evidence of the fact that even though there aren't words, it's communicating something, and I can still laugh about it to this day, and I do. So be there for your students. If they want to try out using comics to express themselves, be there. Use what we talked about to be informed and inform them, and hopefully the comics will be prosperous for you and as well them.
In closure, I want to reemphasize the importance of being aware of ableism and the strategies offered in this presentation to critique stereotypes of people with disabilities. And some of those stereotypes we see repeated over and over again, the pathetic, the evil, or just invisible, or atmosphere, background. Super crip, and that's also a stereotype that made a joke of, or the whiner, the burden, non-sexual, non-human. And when you really work this activity with your students, you'll see that as they name the comics and the graphic narratives or film and other popular culture, that these stereotypes happen over and over again. And it gives, first being able to see that and critique that, but it also gives a motivation to create something different, try to find another storyline. Michelle?
And the other thing, in examining those stereotypes and those alternative stories, some questions to ask, some criteria for creation might be, is the character who is experiencing the disability, are they valued within the story? Are they portrayed as being unique from the other characters, but also contributory? Is it their strengths that are the empowering force within that narrative story? The comic books and the anime that you examine as a class together, created by other individuals, and also what you have your students creating within the classroom. Valued, unique, and contributory are the way each one of us would want to be portrayed in comics, and it can be such a unique and rich experience for students drawing from their own experiences and sharing their own stories using text and image.
With that, we'd like to share our appreciation to Lisa D'Amico, coordinator of the VSA affiliate, and the Office of VSA and Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts for supporting this webinar. And we really want to thank all of you in attendance. And at this moment, we would like to turn it over to you, and we invite questions and comments, and to share your experiences using comics to include difference.
All right, well, thank you. We've already had a few questions come in throughout the presentation, so I'm going to share some of those. So Heidi wanted to know, she says she's interested in how manga attracts ASD, Asperger's children and teens. What are your thoughts?
I would think, in my limited experience of working with individuals with autism and knowing what I know, I think that, and for those on the autism spectrum, I think there's a wonderful level of detail that any one of us could get lost in trying to portray a story and reading a story. There's so much wonderful detail in a lot of those graphic novels that is just engaging to everyone. And so I think it can be an immersive experience, and I think that that's what we see maybe at play in working with individuals with Asperger's syndrome and on those higher ends of the autism spectrum. So.
Karen, Nadia would like to know, are your ideas about using comics, are those just for people on the autism spectrum or for any disability? Can I use these ideas with comics with people with intellectual disabilities as well?
Absolutely. So it's not, as Veronica said, it's not going to be for everybody, but certainly a wide range of differences and disabilities, and we'll talk about one of the things, like I mentioned, dyslexia, but because of those ideas of the contextual cues, comics and graphic narrative novels are actually very accessible for understanding, and whether you can read the words or not, there's a story that can be told, and whether you're creating it or you're teaching something through the graphic narrative. And so this is really a wonderful thing to actually, this is a way to create community or partner people up, so that there's like, how can I teach something? How can I teach something that includes you, my partner, in the story, includes you and me in that story? And so this is all, it's really the social aspects of the stigmas of, like, that person can understand, all these kinds of things. It can break through those barriers because it is an accessible in many ways. It's because of the visual cues, because of the context, because of the short, like Veronica was talking about, the the space between the making meaning. And so like even that non sequitur idea that you see the one baby image but with the Mickey Mouse kind of ears on it, and then if you look at the other image, it's like, okay, how does this even relate? So that begins a kind of thinking, an exploratory kind of process that a range of kind of investigation at different levels of thinking or at different levels of abilities can actually enter in. So yes, it's really is very, very approachable for a wide range of difference.
And I want to piggyback on that. You know, so many of the examples that we looked at in this presentation were from adults experiencing autism, but that's only because that was just my most recent experience, and so I brought those into this discussion. But all three of us have worked very extensively with individuals and with classrooms where we have a wide variance of learners, as many of you have. And the thing that Karen said earlier about that core idea of how am I going to teach this and how am I going to teach this in a way that includes everybody is the core question to anything we do in the classroom. But I also want to emphasize the relational aspect. What is the role of narrative if not to share? And so setting up scenarios in your classrooms and setting up activities in the classrooms where everyone is collaborative, where everyone is having that opportunity to be the individual within a community and is contributing to that community in that way. So, and those things, they don't happen accidentally. They have to be orchestrated. They have to be set up that way. So.
Thank you. I think we have just gone past our 4 o'clock ending time. So I'm going to take back control from you, Karen. And I'm going to ask you, our webinar participants, to remain on the webinar a few moments longer after it ends and complete a short evaluation survey that opens when you close the window. I definitely read through everything that you write. I share them as feedback with our presenters, so you're taking the time to share your feedback is definitely valued. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me, Lisa D'Amico, at lvdamico@kennedy-center.org. And I hope that you will keep an eye out for next year's VSA webinar season and will join us for the upcoming webinars. So thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Karen, Michelle, and Veronica.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.